13 Days is a 2000 American historical drama thriller film directed by Roger Donaldson dramatizing the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, seen from the perspective of the U.S. political leadership. Kevin Costner stars, with Bruce Greenwood featured as President John F. Kennedy, Stephen Culp as Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy, and Dylan Baker as Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara. While the movie carries the same name as the book 13 Days by former Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy, it is in fact based on a different book, The Kennedy Tapes. Inside the White House During the Cuban Missile Crisis by Ernest May and Philip Zelikow. It is the second docudrama made about the crisis, the first being 1974's The Missiles of October, which was based on Kennedy's book. The 2000 film contains some newly declassified information not available to the earlier production, but takes greater dramatic license, particularly in its choice of Kenneth O'Donnell as protagonist. Plot. In October 1962, U-2 surveillance photos reveal that the Soviet Union is in the process of placing missiles carrying nuclear weapons in Cuba. President John F. Kennedy and his advisors must come up with a plan of action to prevent their activation. Kennedy is determined to show that the United States will not allow a missile threat. The Joint Chiefs of Staff advise immediate U.S. military strikes against the missile sites followed by an invasion of Cuba. However, Kennedy is reluctant to attack and invade because it would very likely cause the Soviets to invade Berlin, which could lead to an all-out war. Citing the guns of August, Kennedy sees an analogy to the events that started World War I, where the tactics of both sides' commanders had not evolved since the previous war and were obsolete, only this time nuclear weapons are involved. War appears to be almost inevitable. The Kennedy administration tries to find a solution that will remove the missiles but avoid an act of war. They settle on a step less than a blockade, which is formally regarded as an act of war. They settle on what they publicly describe as a quarantine. They announce that the U.S. naval forces will stop all ships entering Cuban waters and inspect them to verify they are not carrying weapons destined for Cuba. The Soviet Union sends mixed messages in response. Off the shores of Cuba, the Soviet ships turned back from the quarantine lines. Secretary of State Dean Rusk says, "We're eyeball to eyeball and I think the other fellow just blinked." John A. Scaly, a reporter with ABC News, is contacted by Soviet emissary Alexander Fomin, and through this back-channel communication method the Soviets offer to remove the missiles in exchange for public assurances from the U.S. that it will never invade Cuba. A long message in the same tone as the informal communication from Fomin, apparently written personally by Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev, is received. This is followed by a second, more hardline cable in which the Soviets offer a deal involving U.S. removal of its Jupiter missiles from Turkey. The Kennedy administration interprets the second as a response from the Politburo, and in a risky act, decides to ignore it and respond to the first message, assumed to be from Khrushchev. There are several missteps during the crisis. The defense readiness level of Strategic Air Command is raised to DEFCON 2. Without informing the president, a nuclear weapon test proceeds and a routine test launch of a U.S. offensive missile is also carried out without the president's knowledge. In a bid for time while under intense pressure from the military for an immediate strike, President Kennedy authorizes attacks on the missile sites and an invasion of Cuba to commence the following Monday. A U-2 reconnaissance plane is sent over Cuba to gather intelligence for the attack, but is shot down, killing the pilot. After much deliberation with the Executive Committee of the National Security Council, Kennedy makes a final attempt to avoid a war by sending his brother, Robert F. Kennedy, to meet with Soviet Ambassador Anatoly Dobryna on Friday night. Dobryna insists that the U.S. must also remove all Jupiter missiles from Turkey, on the border of the Soviet Union. Bobby says that a quid pro quo is not possible, but in exchange for Khrushchev removing all the missiles from Cuba, there will be a secret understanding that the U.S. will remove all of its obsolete missiles from Turkey within 6 months as part of a pre-scheduled plan. The Soviets announce on Sunday that they will remove their missiles from Cuba, averting a war that could have escalated to the use of nuclear weapons. The film ends with President Kennedy dictating a letter of condolence to the family of the reconnaissance pilot who was shot down over Cuba as part of the preparations for the invasion. Cast. Production. The film was co-produced by several companies, including New Line Cinema, Costner's TIG Productions and Jan Bernstein's Beacon Pictures. The Department of Defense cooperated to some extent, allowing the producers to film on several bases. In order to keep the film in period, filming took place on ships from the time of the crisis that still existed in the active fleet, and ships preserved as museums. Aircraft that still exist from the period were refurbished to appear operational as well. Release and reception. The film was given a limited theatrical release on Christmas Day 2000, but wide release did not occur until January 12, 2001. With a staggered release to various countries throughout most of the year. The film was a box office bomb, grossing only $66,579,890 worldwide against an $80 million budget. 13 Days received positive reviews from critics. Roger Ebert of the Chicago Sun-Times gave 13 Days a rating of 3 stars out of 4 and said, "The movie's taut, flat style is appropriate for a story that is more about facts and speculation than about action." Kennedy and his advisors study high-altitude photos and intelligence reports, and wonder if Khrushchev's word can be trusted. Everything depends on what they decide. The movie shows men in unknotted ties and shirt sleeves, grasping coffee cups or whiskey glasses and trying to sound rational while they are at some level terrified. Things might not have happened exactly like this, but it sure did feel like they did. Rotten Tomatoes reports that 83% of 117 critics have given the film positive reviews with an average rating of 7.2/10, and the consensus 13 Days offers a compelling look at the Cuban Missile Crisis, and its talented cast deftly portrays the real-life people who were involved. On Metacritic, however, some former Kennedy officials and contemporary historians, including Arthur Schlesinger Jr., Special Counsel Ted Sorensen, and Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, have criticized the film for the depiction of Special Assistant Kenneth O'Donnell as chief motivator of Kennedy and others during the crisis. Prior to seeing the movie, McNamara reacted to the premise in a PBS NewsHour interview. "For God's sakes, Kenny O'Donnell didn't have any role whatsoever in the missile crisis. He was a political appointment secretary to the president. That's absurd." According to McNamara, the duties performed by O'Donnell in the film are closer to the role Sorensen played during the actual crisis. "It was not Kenny O'Donnell who pulled us all together, it was Ted Sorensen." However, after seeing the movie, McNamara remarked that while he still thought the filmmakers took some creative liberties with certain characters, he ultimately thought that it was a reasonable historical portrayal of the crisis.